When you think about the major industrial catastrophes of, the modern age Chernobyl, Deepwater Horizon, they are just etched into our global memory.
Absolutely. The images, the media coverage, it's instant, it's everywhere. You can't avoid it.
But the thing we're looking at today is that one of the worst, maybe the worst industrial disaster in history, just in terms of pure human cost, happened with shockingly little sustained international attention at the time.
We're talking about the Bhopal gas tragedy, December 1984.
And the numbers, when you actually look at the raw statistics, it's just baffling that this wasn't front page news across the world for months. We're talking about a huge release of methyl isocyanate, or MIC gas, from the Union Carbide India Limited, the UCIL pesticide plant in Bhopal, India.
And the scale, I mean, that's what defines this deep dive. You have over 500,000 people, 500,000 people exposed to this toxic cloud.
500,000.
The official immediate death toll was 3,787.
Which is already a staggering number.
It is. But when you factor in the thousands who died later from all the gas-related diseases, the total is claimed to be well over 16,000.
16,000. And the injuries. I mean, that's what turns this from just a terrible accident into this ongoing generational health crisis. Over 558,000 people were injured.
And nearly 4,000 of them with permanent, severely disabling injuries. So this wasn't a one-day thing.
No, this was the birth of what you'd call a chronic disaster.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack the source material to figure out how this was even possible. We're going to look at the mechanical failures, the deep-seated corporate problems, and we have to get into the really conflicting stories about what caused it, negligence or sabotage.
And then the aftermath, the decades-long toll that's still being felt right now.
Right.
Okay, so let's set the stage. The UCIL plant is built back in '69, but the unit that handled this really toxic chemical, methyl isocyanate, that was added in 1979.
And they were making 7, a popular pesticide.
Mm.
But the ownership structure, that's really key for you to understand. UCIL was publicly traded in India, but the American company, Union Carbide Corporation, UCC, they had majority ownership.
And operational control.
And operational control. That becomes critical when we start talking about who's responsible.
And the sources are really clear on this. This wasn't some kind of bolt from the blue accident. The warning signs were there for years.
They were screaming. I mean, as far back as 1976, you had trade unions complaining about pollution at the plant.
And then it got worse.
Much worse. In 1981, there was a death. A worker died after inhaling phosgene gas because he panicked and took his mask off. That points to a major failure in safety culture, in training.
So you have pollution, a death, then more leaks of both phosgene and MIC in 1982. And the local press was definitely paying attention. There's this one journalist, Rajkumar Kiswani, who wrote something just chilling in the local paper.
What was the quote?
He urged, "Wake up, people of Bhopal. You are on the edge of a volcano."
Wow. And it's just fascinating and horrifying how the company seemed to just ignore all this while. At the same time, they were creating the perfect conditions for a total failure.
How so?
Well, by the early 80s, demand for pesticides had dropped off. But production, it just kept going. So they ended up with this massive amount of unused liquid MIC just sitting there.
And MIC is not something you just want to have sitting around. What were the safety rules for storing it?
UCC's own internal rules were very clear. The storage tanks, they should be filled no more than 50%. That's about 30 tons. The idea was to leave a huge buffer.
A safety margin.
Exactly, because MIC is so reactive.
Yeah, I can see it.
But the tank that ruptured, tank E610,
That one contained 42 tons, way over the limit.
almost 40% over. But here's where it gets really sort of mechanically interesting and where the disaster became almost inevitable. In late October of '84, that tank lost its ability to hold nitrogen pressure.
Okay, wait, why is nitrogen pressure so critical?
All right, so the nitrogen gas pressure was essential for 2 reasons.
Yeah.
1, it kept the MIC stable, stopped it from reacting with anything. 2, and this is the most important part, that pressure was the only way they could pump the liquid out of the tank.
So if the tank loses pressure,
Those 42 tons of highly toxic chemical are basically trapped. They're stuck inside a container you can't empty, sitting way above the safety limit, just waiting for something to go wrong.
that's the point of no return.
It absolutely was. The critical failure was now sealed inside that tank.
Okay, let's move to the night itself. December 2nd to 3rd, 1984. The main theory, the one you hear most, is that water got into tank E610.
Right, during an attempt to unclog a pipe. And that water, combined with, contaminants, high temperatures, rest from the pipes, it just kicked off a runaway exothermic reaction.
Meaning it started generating its own heat.
And fast. At 10:30 p.m., the tank pressure was normal, about 2 psi. By 11 p.m., so just 30 minutes later, it jumped to 10 psi.
And the workers saw this,
Yeah.
but they ignored it.
They dismissed it. They thought the gauge was broken. And this is a key detail. That pressure gauge had been malfunctioning for about a week.
So they had normalized failure.
They had. They had seen so many dangerous signals that when the real one came, they just assumed it was another broken sensor.
So when did they realize it wasn't?
By 12:40 a.m., a little over an hour later, the temperature was literally off the scale, and the pressure just skyrocketed to between 40 and 55 psi.
Yeah.
At that point, the emergency relief valve it burst.
And this is where all the backup systems, the layers of safety equipment, were supposed to kick in, but they didn't. This section of the sources, it just reads like a checklist of failures, all driven by cost cutting.
It's stunning. Let's just walk through them.
Okay, first, the refrigeration system. That was supposed to keep the MIC cool, stable, at about 4.5 degrees Celsius.
That had been shut down since 1982 to save money on electricity. So the MIC was sitting at 20 degrees Celsius, way hotter than it should have been.
Unbelievable. Okay, failure two, the flare tower. That's meant to burn off any escaping gas.
It was disconnected for maintenance.
Yeah.
And even if it had been on, it wasn't big enough to handle a leak that massive anyway. It was just fundamentally the wrong size.
And the last line of defense, the vent gas scrubber that neutralizes the gas with caustic soda.
Also off. It was on standby, and it didn't have enough chemicals or power to work properly anyway. So every single safety system was either off, broken, or just plain inadequate.
So you have a runaway reaction, no safety systems, and 30 to 40 tons of MIC gas escaping over 2 hours with the wind blowing it right over Bhopal.
And the aftermath was just utter chaos. The plant's internal alarm went off at 12:50 a.m., but the public siren,
Which they had disconnected from the internal one.
right back in 1982, that public siren was sounded for a moment and then turned off.
Why? Why would you turn it off?
Company procedure. Unbelievably, it was to avoid alarming the public over what they probably thought was a small leak, so the public never got a real warning.
And the authorities were told everything was fine.
When the police called the plant, they were told twice, everything is okay. This just delayed any kind of emergency response until it was far, far too late.
And the hospitals had no idea what they were dealing with.
None. The city's main hospital, Hamidiat, they were first told it was an ammonia leak, then phosgene, then finally MI, a chemical the staff had never heard of. They had no idea how to treat it, no antidote. They're basically fighting a ghost.
And the gas itself, it's about twice as dense as air, right? So it hugged the ground.
It did, which meant it just blanketed the low-lying neighborhoods. And children, shorter people sleeping on the floor, they inhaled much higher concentrations. The immediate cause of death was choking, their lungs filling with fluid. A horrible way to die.
And as soon as the sun came up, this stopped being just a chemical disaster and it became a legal battleground. It all centered on two completely different explanations.
Exactly. And the whole question of liability hinges on this. Was it gross corporate negligence, or was it deliberate sabotage by a worker?
Let's start with the negligence argument. The evidence there seems, pretty overwhelming. It's all about underinvestment, cost cutting.
Right. We know they cut about $1.25 million from the budget, which directly led to weaker safety rules and quality control.
And staffing. They cut the number of MIC operators in half.
Only 6 of the original 12 were left. And there was no maintenance supervisor on the night shift. On top of that, you have workers trying to use these complex technical manuals written in English, a language most of them weren't fluent in.
So fewer staff, less training, manuals they can't really read, and equipment running way too high. It just sounds like a textbook case of a system-wide failure waiting to happen.
And a UCC audit from 1982 basically confirms that. 2 years before the disaster, their own safety team found 61 hazards in the MIC units. 30 of them were major. But they never sent a team to make sure any of it got fixed.
That's a powerful argument for negligence. But then you have the other side, the sabotage theory, which UCC pushed based on an investigation by a firm called Arthur D. Little.
Right. Their report concluded that water couldn't have gotten in by accident. They said the pipes were bone dry, and the water pressure just wasn't high enough to cause a backflow into the tank.
So if it wasn't an accident, what was their explanation?
They argued that a disgruntled employee deliberately connected a water hose directly to an open port on the tank.
Is there evidence for that?
Well, they cited a witness who said that the local pressure gauge on tank E610 was missing right after the disaster. And, crucially, a water hose was found lying on the ground right next to that empty port.
That's a pretty specific and damning detail.
It is. They also alleged that the operational log files were tampered with afterward. And the logs themselves showed that right before the explosion, the crew was trying to pump 1 ton of material out of the tank.
Why would they do that?
The sabotage theory says they had discovered the water and were desperately trying to drain it from the bottom of the tank before the reaction went critical.
So two totally different stories. But regardless of the cause, the legal outcome was, well, it was hugely controversial.
UCC paid a $470 million settlement in 1989, a tiny fraction of the $3.3 billion the Indian government was asking for.
And the U.S. courts mostly ruled that UCIL was a separate Indian-run entity, which basically shielded the American parent company, UCC, from direct blame in the U.S.
Right. It wasn't until 2010 that 7 Indian UCIL employees were convicted of causing death by negligence. They got 2 years and were all out on bail almost immediately.
So now we have to shift to the chronic disaster, the long-term toll. What's shocking here is that the Indian Council of Medical Research wasn't allowed to publish its health data for 10 years, until 1994.
A 10-year knowledge gap. It made effective long-term treatment almost impossible to coordinate. And people are still living with the consequences today, 40 years later. Chronic eye problems, scarred lungs, neurological issues like memory loss, and widespread PTSD.
And the impact on the next generation is maybe the most heartbreaking part. Bhopal now has a miscarriage rate that is 7 times the national average.
7 times. Alongside incredibly high rates of birth defects in the children of survivors. And this isn't just a health disaster, it's an environmental one that's still happening.
Because the factory site itself became a toxic dump.
Exactly. Tests from as far back as 1989 showed the soil and water were toxic. And today, they're still finding mercury, lead, and carbon tetrachloride in the groundwater.
And the levels are insane.
1,000 times the maximum limit recommended by the World Health Organization.
1,000 times, 4 decades later. The sheer staying power of this problem is hard to comprehend. And the cleanup has been so slow.
Painfully slow. I mean, the sources point out that just this past January, in 2025, they finally removed about 377 tons of toxic waste from the site after 40 years. And even that caused protests at the disposal site. The problem doesn't go away, it just moves.
So looking back at everything we've unpacked, we've gone from corporate cost-cutting to a complete system failure to this decades-long public health and environmental crisis. What's the main takeaway for you?
That this wasn't one single accident. It was a cascade of failures. It's a devastating example of what happens when you have these huge knowledge gaps, when systems fail, and when a company puts its budget ahead of basic, fundamental human safety.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, it really highlights the challenge of accountability, doesn't it? When you have a global company operating in a developing nation.
Absolutely. UCC sold its stake in UCIL in 1994. Dow Chemical then bought UCC in 2001. And the subsequent court rulings that basically absolved UCC and Dow of liability for the site contamination, at least in U.S. courts, it raises a really important question for you, the listener, to think about.
Which is?
How should we enforce global standards and liability when the consequences of a corporate decision cross international borders and last for generations, far outliving the event itself? That really is the enduring, unresolved legacy of Bhopal.